Good morning, folks. So we've been pretty much on shelter in place for the last 35 or 36 days, and outside of a trip to the grocery store and a couple of my job sites that are just a few miles from the house, haven't really been out. And I've decided that on this Friday morning it would be really a good idea for my mental health if I got out and got up early before the sunrise and came out to one of my favorite spots here just north of the house for a sunrise. So that's what I'm going to do this morning. You can kind of see behind me that it might turn out a little okay, might not. Just wanted to get out. I think that having been in the house for so long now without getting out and getting some shutter therapy is what I like to call it, starting to go a little stir crazy. And so I've chosen a spot where I'm the only one here. There's definitely some social distancing going on. I don't have to worry about sharing space with anybody. It's a little cold this morning. It's only 43 ambient, and right next to the water I think it's a little cooler than that. But I'm going to get to work and see if I can make a couple of images. If I don't, that's okay. It's really all about just getting out and not being cooped up in the house all day. And just the act of getting out and getting some fresh air, doing a little walking, is probably going to be really good for the brain. So we'll see what happens. I'm hoping it turns out. Alright, well, the sun's come up and my morning sunrise shoot on the lake is over. It was really nice to get out and clear my mind, get some fresh air, make a couple of exposures, and get a little bit of what I call shutter therapy. We've been in the house now, cooped up for 35, 36 days with only limited trips out. So it was really nice to kind of get out and get some fresh air, be by the water. Got my feet a little bit wet. The sunrise wasn't epic. It wasn't something special, but it still was really nice to get out. So this next episode on the channel is going to be all about my digital editing workflow. This is a subject that has come up a lot. A lot of people have wanted to know how I create the images that I do. I've been giving presentations on this subject for a while now here in the North Georgia area, and it's been well received. I've had a lot of people tell me that they really enjoyed my simplified approach to it, and that the edited images don't look overcooked or overdone. So today's episode is going to be all about my digital editing workflow. I look forward to sharing it with you. So let's head on back to the studio, get some breakfast, get some coffee, and get started. Welcome back to the studio, folks. I've just returned from my sunrise shoot out on the lake, and it's time to start editing the images from this little outing this morning. So today's episode is going to be all about my digital editing workflow, basically from import all the way through the final image. This is something that I've been giving presentations on here in the North Georgia area, and it's something that's been requested by a lot of people here locally that want to see how I create my images. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be working in Lightroom, and we're going to basically start right after I import the images, everything I do all the way through the final image. So let's get started. Alright, so I have already imported all of my images from the sunrise shoot on the lake to Lightroom. one of the first things I will do is I will put keywords to all of the set. I sort this out by camera and lens, and then also the location, any kind of keywords that might be associated with it, whether they were long exposures. I try to apply the basic keywords to the entire set if possible. For this particular morning, I shot everything with one camera and one lens, so I can apply those keywords that I like for these images to the whole set. I've been doing this in Lightroom now. I used to do this part in Bridge to my final images. I'm trying to simplify my workflow and limit the number of programs I'm bringing images into and working in, and trying to create a better catalog. So applying these keywords here in Lightroom will allow me to filter and sort and find things by these different keywords later on in the future. So the first thing, again, I've edited the keywords for the images, and now it is time to go into the actual set of images and start my review of those images. My first step is to just kind of go through and see which ones I might like. Which compositions do I like? If I like a composition, I'll give it a 4 or 5 stars so that I can start to whittle it down and narrow it down to the images that might get edited one day. So I go through and I kind of like that one. It's got a little bit of the moon and little pink clouds. But it's an angle on this tree I've shot before, so it's not maybe a 5-star image, but it might be a 4-star image. I might come back and edit that one day if I get bored. On a long trip, 3, 4, 5 days, I'll have a whole lot more images to go through and have a lot more that I'm going to want to edit. From this particular morning, I shot 48 frames, and out of 48, I'm going to want to edit one. And this is the very first one I shot, and it's the one we're going to edit today. It is the one that is the most unique in the set for me. It is an image that I've wanted to capture of this tree for a while, but the conditions have to be just right for me. If the water level is too low, the really rocky lake bed shows up, and I don't like all of the distraction in that. If the water level is too high, you can't see all of these rocks and the roots, and the bottom of the tree is in the water. And I've seen it that way. I've seen it where this tree is fully submerged in the water. It's kind of rare, but it has happened. But on this particular morning, the water level was just right. It had just come right up to the baseline rocks, and the rocky bottom of the lake bed is not really visible. So I shot this to try to make sure that the branches and the leaves of this particular tree were fully out of these branches and leaves here, so that there's no overlap. That way we can work with that stuff later on in the editing process. So this is the image that I want to edit. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that. The first thing I do is go in and set my lens corrections, because again, this is that Zeiss Batis 18mm lens that has a little bit of barrel distortion to it. You can just see how it flattens that out a little bit. I don't like how much Lightroom takes out the vignette. I am really a fan of the natural light fall off that lens has. I like the vignette. I like keeping the corners just a little bit dark, holds the eye in a little bit. I don't like it to be overly white and light on the edges. So that's why I have lens corrections set up here at the top. I kind of have Lightroom set up so that I can just work my way down through the different commands. So now that we have the lens corrections applied, I can start the rest of the editing of this image. Today, this image is not going to be just a single frame. It is not going to be a 5 or 6 image blend, but it is an image that I am going to want to make 2 images out of this one and double process the original file. That way I can make sure that nothing moved when I start to blend the images together. So I'm going to make all of my basic edits and adjustments to the base file before I create the virtual copy or the second copy of this image. So I'm going to start with my color temperature and white balance, warming it up just a little bit, increasing the magenta just a little bit. The Sony files I learned early on, for my taste, needed a little bit more magenta tint to them than my old Canon files did. And then I go in and start to edit my exposure. Yes, it looks like it's getting a little blown out there, but we're going to fix that in the next step. Part of my workflow theory or kind of outlook on how editing is done is it's not done in one step. There's not one slider or one key stroke that will fix an image completely. Every image for me requires little steps, little increments, little fine-tuning from every different slider, and all put together ends up making what becomes my final image. It's not done with one slider, and it's not done with big adjustments, it's done with little adjustments. But knowing what my camera is good at makes it easy for me to shoot that way so that I can edit it the way I want it to look when I'm done. For the Sony a7R II that I was using on this particular morning, I know that it recovers shadows really well, better than I feel that it recovers highlights. So I shoot to protect the highlights, and I'll recover the shadows in my editing process. So I've increased the exposure just a little bit. You can see that it's brought out some of the texture and color in the rocks. I'm going to increase the contrast just a little bit. I usually do most of my contrast editing later on in Photoshop. And here's where I come in and salvage the highlights back. I encourage you to play with these sliders as you learn what they do. Does it go too far? Is it not far enough? Part of the way you learn how to edit an image or what your camera's images can tolerate is going crazy with the sliders. You can see that I've maxed that out and I've got all that color again, but really no noise to show for it. So I know that my camera can edit the shadows and bring that back. All of those leaves all of a sudden have all of their natural color that the camera can pick up, that our eyes can see, but that the original base file can't without editing. But I don't want to go that far. But that's kind of the concept of learning this is experiment with it. Figure out what can be done. Learn what your camera is good at so that you can shoot for those things and conditions when you're out in the field. So on this image, I don't want it to be so bright like that. I know I could do it like that, and some people probably like to just throw the highlights all the way down to minus 100 and the shadows all the way up to plus 100, but I'm not that kind of person. I like to have a little bit of shadow and mystery in my images. So I'm going to come in and brighten up my whites point just a little bit and darken my black point just a little bit. You can see it started to clip again, but again, this is the base image for all global edits. I don't really need to pay attention to the shadows yet because I know in my head that I'm going to edit a second image for that area. So again, this is the global edits for this particular image. And then I'm going to increase my texture in this one just a little bit. You see that it only affects the areas in here. That slider is not going to affect this out here. You can go really crazy with it and it gets really crunchy. I'm not a fan of crunchy. I'm not going to touch the clarity slider on this particular image, and I'm not going to do much with the dehaze. I'm going to give it just a little bit of a boost. Probably won't even be able to see that on the screen. And again, down here on vibrance and saturation, I'm only using little tiny inputs. Very, very minor. The next thing I like to do on images like this, particularly that are long exposures, is I like to raise the black points just a little bit in the curves. Not a lot, just to soften them. Kind of goes along with that ethereal feel of a long exposure. At this point, I've made some of my global edits that I'm happy with. I'm now going to go in and see if there's any really big spots that I need to deal with. The spot remover in Lightroom is pretty good. It's not my favorite, but it's pretty good. It can show me if I have a whole bunch of them to deal with or if I have just a few. One thing to try to use is this visualize spots. I'm surprised at the number of people that don't know about this little checkmark box here. But what it does is it brings it up and helps you visualize where those spots are. I can see that I have one right there and one right there and there. And a little bit of light coming through the trees there that I didn't like. I'm going to hold off and fix these in Photoshop. I have a way that I do that in Photoshop that I like a little better. I don't have a lot to do on this one. The camera had recently been cleaned, so it was pretty clear and pretty clean. So now I think I've got my global edits done on my base file. I'm going to come back and check my clipping on both black point and white point. I see that I'm good on both of those. So now I'm ready to create my virtual copy, the one that is going to be my double edit of the single exposure. So I come to the file, I right click on it, and create virtual copies. So this is now my virtual copy. You can see 2 of 2. This is my virtual copy of that image. The great thing about virtual copies is it lets you make a second set of edits on an image without actually having another raw file. It just writes it into the data in Lightroom. It's a great tool when you want to do something like this, or when you want to have multiple different versions of what you're editing. Maybe you're not really set on the white balance. Maybe you're not really set on the exposure. You can make as many virtual copies as you want, and then you can compare them all. I use virtual copies quite a bit for very different reasons. Sometimes to be able to show in a presentation what the straight out of camera image looked like compared to the final edit. Virtual copies are a great thing. I encourage you to learn how to use them. I use them all the time. So on this one, now that I have created that, I'm going to increase my exposure just a little bit more. And on this one, because I am really only paying attention to what happens here in this triangular shape of land, I'm going to increase the shadow recovery, the opposite of what I went with the original file. You can see it's brought out a lot more detail. And we'll see here when we take these into Photoshop what I'm doing with that. I'm not going to be recovering it back to that level. So that's the only changes I'm making to that virtual copy. Now I have my master file and the virtual copy, and I'm ready to open those in Photoshop. So I'm going to select both of them, right click, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. And what this does is it brings the two raw files over into Photoshop and puts them into one file as layers. Depending on how fast your computer is, this may take just a few seconds. It may take a little longer. With mine, it takes a little longer, so we'll speed it up. Okay, so Photoshop has now brought both of these files in. It's put them both in layers. I typically like to put my darker layer on the bottom and let the lighter layer be on top, in particular because I usually will be adding light back to the dark frame, so I want the lighter layer on top. You can see that they are both here. I select them both just to make sure that they're lined up. Auto align, I left it on auto. Shouldn't be any problem. If you're working with multiple exposures, That is something that's very important to do. It will line up the base parts of the image so that you can make sure that everything lines up and you don't get any ghosting or outlines from the shift of maybe the image in camera. But these are perfectly aligned because they were one frame. So with my bright layer on top, I want to create a layer mask that I'm going to fill with all black so that it is showing me that none of that top layer is being applied to this image on the bottom. Then I can go in with my brush tool, reversing my color palette, making my brush a little bit bigger, and setting my opacity to 25%. I can start painting in some of that lighter frame into this image. I want to bring in just a little bit of the shoreline, just a little bit of the rocks below the water. But mostly I'm trying to bring in just a little bit of the detail in the rocks here. I can zoom in, change the size of my brush, paint just a little more in here, paint it selectively in. Add in the light where I want it, where it was really kind of showing up in the image to start with, which is along the leading faces of the rocks. This little rock was catching a little light. It was nice. So that's really about it for that. I'm pretty much done. You can see that I've only really brought in a little bit of it, and I haven't done it with creating really complicated luminosity masks or image selections. I've just done it by feel, and I've done it with a soft edge brush that has a hardness set down to almost 0 or 0, and in various sizes of brushes. And I've been able to kind of, season to taste. That's kind of what image editing is. It's kind of like cooking. You season it to taste, whatever your taste might be. Some people like things a little more salty. I like things a little spicy. I like to blend my highlights back into my dark frames a little more. So now that I've done that, I will select both of the layers, and on a PC, Shift Control Alt E, or on a Mac, Shift Command Option E, creates a layer of those two, and I will call that my blended layer. Now everything I edit on is the combination of those two. I can turn those two off and nothing happens. I turn that one off and it gives you white. That means that I am working on the combination of those two frames. So now I'm going to go in and do some more editing. The first thing I want to do, like we learned in episode number 1, is to make sure my horizon is straight. Because of where I was shooting, it was a little hard to get to, and the camera was down low, so I had a hard time seeing if it was perfect. But as I discussed in the last episode, the in-camera level is only so good. I like to make sure that it is perfect in Photoshop. And see, that's that ½ degree. In camera, the level said it was good. It's just about ½ degree out. But it's just enough that I can pick up on it, and I want to fix it. So then I will come back in and set my boundaries. Making sure I keep what I find is important. And to me, the importance is this rock down here in the bottom. I don't want to lose that in the frame. The sky I'm not so worried about as long as I'm not clipping this top of this tree. I want to keep my aspect ratio the same 2:3 that it was in camera. So I've got my crop set. I kind of want to keep the tree centered in the frame. And there's my crop. Now I know what I'm editing and what I'm working on. The next thing I'm going to do is do some cloning work. And anytime I do cloning work, I always try to make a new layer all by itself. So I will do Control or Command J for a new copy of that layer, and then I call it clone. I'm not a big fan of adding things into an image. When I shot this scene, the moon was still in the sky to the east, but because I'm faced more to the west and north, I'm not a big fan of maybe bringing that moon in over to this side, but I am a big fan of getting rid of things that are distracting. And to me, these tree branches here are distracting. When I shot the frame, I made sure that there wasn't any overlap so that I could have a nice clear, clean sky break between this tree that is my subject and this tree branches that are distracting. So now I'm going to use content aware fill to eliminate that stuff. And that's Shift F5 is the standard Photoshop command for that. And I use the lasso tool to just kind of go in and around as close as I want to loosely and make a selection around the stuff that I want to get rid of. And then Shift F5. It takes a couple of tries. It's not perfect the first time, and you usually have to do a little refinement, but that did a pretty good job pretty quickly. I got a little piece here and a little piece there that I still need to work on to get them blended out nicely. But now they're all gone, and that tree is all gone. Makes a huge difference in the image to me. Big visual impact. But there's a couple of other little things I want to get rid of also. Out here in the water, there's a couple of little distracting floaties, something in the water, debris, bugs, stuff like that I don't really care for. Kind of visually distracting, so I just get rid of them. Again, using the content aware fill, it does a really good job of just getting rid of those little things that I don't like. I'm going to leave that one over there because that one's a rock, but I am going to get rid of this one. And that one. And then I've pretty much gotten rid of all the little distractions that I don't like. And that's my clone layer. So I can turn it on and off and see what I've removed. I like it the way it is now. So now I can go on to my editing through my plugins through the Nick collection by DxO. The first one I always do is Color Effects Pro. I love this plugin. Just about every image that I edit goes through this program. Whether it's a race car image, a people portrait, architecture, landscapes, it all goes through this plugin. I love that you can swipe left and right with the little divider and see your effects that you've created. The Pro Contrast tool is one that I use a lot. It's down here on the left. I don't usually use the corrected color cast because I don't want it to mess with that, but I do increase the correct contrast and the dynamic contrast. Again, see, very small increments. I'm not going way over here. I'm not going way over here. That's just too much for me, too heavy-handed. But I tend to use values of 10 to 15. And again, bringing the shadows up. I like softening the shadows in my ethereal landscapes so that the blacks aren't quite so black. Gives it that nice matte, muted look that I'm a fan of. The next filter I usually use is the brilliance and warmth slider. On this one, a little bit of 5 on the saturation. Again, I'm not going way over here. I see a lot of pictures like this that people post, and people love them, and that's great. It's not for me. That's just way beyond anything that is remotely realistic. I'm more in this range. I add a little bit of warmth. I love the way this adds some warmth. And the perceptual saturation is something that really affects the blues quite a bit, particularly in the shadows, and I really like the way that looks. You can toggle it on and off and see what you've done. You can see that the reds here in the rocks have shown up just a little bit more. Again, it's just minor, subtle edits. And then I hit OK. And this usually takes a while, so I will speed this up in video editing. And there you have it. That is the image with color effects. The next filter I use a lot is, again, from the Nik collection, the Vivisa 2 filter. I use this more for targeted adjustments. This plugin has the control points, which are fantastic. I love the control points. It's like it creates its own masks, and you can really target things that you want. So I hit a control point. I want to bring up the shadow, the roots just a tiny bit. Control points, to see what it's affecting, you can come over to the little check mark right next to them, and the white stuff is what this control point is going to affect. The darker stuff, it is not. So I want to bring out just a tiny bit of brightness in those roots, just a tiny bit of the saturation, and just add in just a tiny bit of warmth. And then I want to create another control point here on the red rocks. You can see it's just affecting those. And I want to create just a little bit more warmth in them. Again, 0.9%, very small little edits. Again, another one down here. Just a tiny bit of warmth. Just bring it up just a little bit. Come over here and put one on the trees. You can see that it's affecting the tree trunks. I want to bring out the color in the trees just a tiny bit, and a little bit more of that warmth, just ever so slight. And then I'm done, and then I'll let that speed up in computer editing also. And this is basically the final edited image. At this point, I would save it down to whatever file size I'm outputting it to. If I'm going to print it, I'll print it. If I'm going to just display it on the web for now, I display it on the web at the right size. I don't sharpen my PSD files. I only sharpen my output files. That way I can customize the sharpening to whatever size it's going to be. I tend to sharpen just my output files, and I find that with the Sony a7R II, I don't have to do a lot of sharpening. It's pretty sharp all by itself. There's plenty of detail. I can count all the little twigs and branches and you know, spines on all those little leaves of that tree there. And I don't really need to do a lot of sharpening. So at this point, the image is pretty much done. And now I can export it and be done with it and go on about editing the next image. So I hope that was helpful. And hopefully you learned a few things, or maybe picked up on a couple of things that you can use on editing your images in the future. Well, that wraps up this episode. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you maybe got something out of it. As you can see, my workflow is not really a really elaborate one. There's no secret button that makes an image go from the flat raw file that it starts out at to the finished product. It's little steps, small increments along the way. If you have any questions about today's video, please leave me a comment down in the comments section. If you like it, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because I've got a lot of stuff coming up in the future and don't want you to miss it. So thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks.